Hello and welcome to the video about in-text citation styles for APA 7th edition. You can download this PowerPoint on Canvas, and everything I'm saying today is also in Chapter 8 of the 7th edition of the APA manual. So let's talk about in-text citations. These are where in the text of your paper you're giving credit to other authors for ideas or words. So first, what do you cite? You have to cite everything that's in your reference list at least once. If you don't cite something, don't put it in your reference list. Additionally, don't cite anything unless you've read it. That being said, assuming you've read it, assuming it's going to end up in your reference list, you need to cite all ideas, thoughts, theories, and research from another source. And you have to properly attribute credit in the text of the paper. Now, the number of sources to cite is going to depend on the point being made and the amount of material on the topic. Most papers need to have only one or two citations when they're making a key point. Please, if you say, a basic principle of learning theory is that people can learn from watching others. You don't need to cite 60 papers showing that. Okay. You have to cite both paraphrasing and quotations that you make, and you should, whenever possible, be citing primary sources. Now, in my class, the important thing is to be citing primary sources from the scholarly literature, but when possible, you should go to the original source for an idea. Don't cite someone else's paraphrase when possible. Let's see here. What else? The exception about when you need to include, there are exceptions about when you need to include things in your reference list, and these are either broad citations or if a source is not available. So an example of this is personal communication, emails, material from lectures, etc. If you're generally mentioning websites, like you're saying something like, well, at the American Psychiatric Association website, you don't need to give the exact page necessarily. Although, if you do, it's nice, and the more specific the information is, the better. You may not need to cite common software or apps. You don't need to cite Microsoft Excel if that's what you use to analyze your data. If you are quoting people who are in your own study, you don't need to put those in the reference list. You should, though, put quotation marks around you. And any quotation that is used to be an introduction to a paper or a conclusion, we call those epigraphs. You don't necessarily need to include those in the reference list unless it's cited elsewhere. Okay. Sections 8.7, 8.9, and 8.35 discuss what to exclude from a reference list. So here's some guidelines with in-text citations. Check carefully that the spelling of the author names and the publication dates in the reference list matches what you're citing in the citations, and make sure that both match what was written in the original work. If you introduce an error into the citation format, you might not have your reader be able to hunt down the citation, and that could be a problem. We use an APA author date citation style. That means we're identifying the author by their surname or surnames and the date that the work was published. Paraphrases and quotations both must have the surname of the authors, or if it's a group of authors, then you need to name the author group. It needs the year of publication. You still credit things that aren't accessible in text, but you don't have to put them in your reference list. I said that before. If the work is missing an author, use the title of the work in the in-text citation and have that replace the author's surname. If the title of the work is italicized in the reference in your reference list, you need to italicize it in the title in the in-text citation, and that includes if there's some words italicized and others not. You need to match that. If the title of the reference work is not italicized, then you use double quote marks around the title in the in-text citation. And that's typical with articles or pamphlets or something like that. If you do use a title, you should capitalize the title in the text using what we call title case. That's where important words are capitalized, and so are proper nouns. And if the work has no title, use a description of the work surrounded by square brackets, and that's in sections 8.14 and 9.12 of the APA manual. Like I said, you need to make sure that the author, the surname, the date match what's in your reference list. And you see here what a reference list for a journal article, which is most of what you're citing in psychology, what that looks like. The author's name is highlighted in the light purple, the date's in blue, the title of the article is in yellow, and then the other information is in green. So for Alexander, 2018, Alexander's the surname. The date it was published is 2018. If you're putting the citation completely in parentheses, we call that a parenthetical citation. Notice that there needs to be a comma between the surname and the date. If you're incorporating information from the citation into the passage, we call that a narrative citation. And you put the author's surname outside there and then the date in parentheses, usually. And so you don't need to have anything from the yellow or the green in your in-text citations. If you have one author, then you use the author's name in every in-text citation. You see the example for the parenthetical citation where Crepeau's name is inside the parentheses. For the narrative citation, we put the author's name outside and the date in parentheses. If a work has two or more authors, then you include both authors' name in every in-text citation. If it's a parenthetical citation, then you include an ampersand between the author's names, and notice that there's only a comma after the second author's surname. On the other hand, if it is a narrative citation and you're talking about the authors outside of the citation, then you don't use an ampersand. Instead, you spell out the word and. We never have an ampersand outside of a citation in APA format. You should always be spelling out the word and unless it's inside a citation. For works with three or more authors, then you should shorten the citation and replace the second and third author's names with et al. Et al is a Latin abbreviation meaning and the rest. Et alia, if you want to know what all is short for. Notice that et is not an abbreviation, but al is. So al needs a period, but et does not. If it's a parenthetical citation, there's a comma after al period. If it's a narrative citation, there's not. You do need, though, so we usually just say first author et al, but sometimes if that would create ambiguity, let's say that you have two sets of authors, it's the same people in each one. First set, and they publish two articles the same year, and the first author's the same. Then you need to have different shortened citations. And so if you have two citations by Chavez and his co-authors, then Chavez, Luis, Rodriguez, and Mayer's 2016 is shortened to Chavez, Luis et al. 2016. You're cutting off Rodriguez's and Mayer's names and putting et al. But if there's only three authors and the first two would be the same as the other citation, you say Chavez, Luis, and Bayer 2016. You don't do et al. If you're only cutting out one name. You do it for cutting out two or more names. The important thing is that if you do have two citations published the same year with the same first author, you need to distinguish these so that people understand that Chavez, Luis et al. Is a different article from Chavez, Luis, and Bayer, even though they're both published in 2016. Doesn't happen a lot, but it can happen occasionally. The important thing is that you stretch out the citation, keep naming authors until the citations are different. In this case, you had to name 2 authors, and then for the first citation, we replaced the last 2 with et al. For the other citation, we just include the third author's name because you don't use et al. To replace one author's name. If you have a group author, then you list the full name of the group. If there's an acronym for the group that's really well known, like APA for the American Psychological Association, then you spell out the name of the group the first time, and then you put brackets with the abbreviation inside afterwards. And you see the example of that with the parenthetical citation. And then after you introduce that abbreviation, you use the abbreviation for the rest of the citations. If it's a narrative citation, then you spell out the full name of the group of authors, and then inside the parentheses you put the abbreviation and comma. In your reference list, you don't use the acronym in the reference. You spell out the group for an author, and you alphabetize it in your reference list like you would alphabetize an author. So centers for disease control would be alphabetized as CE, not CDC. You're not required to abbreviate a group author name, but the abbreviation is really well known. It's very convenient to do so, and it saves you space in your paper, and it's a nice option. Okay, let's talk about formatting your parenthetical citations. Put your author and date in parentheses, separated by a comma, like I said. You put the parenthetical citation at the end of a sentence usually, and you put any punctuation after the closing set of the parentheses. So you have an example there: Wayman et al. Close parentheses question mark. If you're putting your in-text citation in the middle of your sentence, then you put any sort of commas or semicolons or anything after your citation. If you're describing your work in parentheses already, then do not put parentheses inside parentheses. You do what we have here in the third example. See Felton, comma, 2016, comma, for more details. You instead of parentheses inside parentheses, you set off the date with a set of commas. Never put 2 sets of parentheses in a row. Combine the information in the 2 sets of parentheses and separate out the information with the colon. So if you say mental health diagnoses, parentheses, e.g., comma, depression and anxiety, and then you want to cite immediately afterwards, put the semicolon there and then cite. Do not have 2 sets of parentheses next to each other ever. That's just confusing. Usually we mention the date immediately after we say the authors, and so if you're doing a narrative citation, Hargett et al., parentheses, 2018, reported. The same thing if you're talking about something you're using possessive, Harris et al.'s, period, apostrophe S, and then the date. Or if you want to talk about the date in the narrative citation, you then don't need to use the parentheses at all. You can say, according to a 2017 review by Birkin and Margolis. If you have multiple citations, then there's no need to list them in any particular order. But in a parenthetical citation, if one set of parentheses has multiple authors, then you alphabetize them by the first author's surname. So coming back here, studies by Warren, comma, Gutierrez, and Stone have examined. Well, okay, you can put those in any order you want. But if you are going to put a bunch of citations in the same set of parentheses, then you need to alphabetize those. If you want to highlight one work from the others, then you can list that first, but then put a semicolon and then say see also, and then the other citations, and you put the remaining citations in alphabetical order. there's other times when we have to clarify citations. I mentioned this first little bit, where if you have multiple works by the same first author instead of authors, then you do abbreviate to et al., but you need to keep listing more than one author until you distinguish. And et al. Cannot replace a single author. I already talked about that. This is in section 8.18 and 8.20 of the APA manual. Oops, went too far. If you have the same authors and dates, so maybe Warren published two different articles that were so brilliant in 2020 and you want to cite both of them, then you differentiate those with a letter. And so if you mention the first one at one point in the paper and the second article another point in the paper, the first one would be Warren 2020A, the next one would be Warren 2020B. Okay. Now when I say first and second, what I mean is the first article, you choose which one's A and which one's B by their title. And so you alphabetize them by title, but you don't consider the words A, and the in the beginning of the title. And then you cite them, and you see examples down here. Like here we have Ortega et al., 2010A, 2010B, 2010C. Those would be three different articles published by Ortega et al., and it would be the same set of co-authors in the same order for the et al. Three different articles from 2010 in the same one. If you have two different articles published in different years, you don't use A or B, and published by the same author. So we have an example here. Zarkowski, ND stands for not dated, 2016, 2019. NDs are works that aren't dated. There's no publication date listed on them, and you list them before years. In press is what you use for a work that has been accepted for publication but is not fully published yet. You may get this if an author sends you a manuscript in advance, or very frequently today online, journals will publish the paper online first, but they haven't figured out which issue it's going to go in, what the page numbers will be, and so they'll call it something like online first. That's in press. In press means accepted for publication but not out yet. Okay. And you see examples of how to order citations within the parentheses. Notice if you have two undated works, you would do N period D period dash A, comma N period D period dash B. Not dated works are not very common. In press is pretty common though. And you just have the year replaced by the words in press. Occasionally you'll have two different authors with the same surname. And when you do that, when you have that, then you need to distinguish. We don't want people to think that you're citing Smith here and Smith there and that they're the same Smith. And so what you do is you list the author's initials. So here we have an example. R. Chen et al. 2011 found that, da-da-da-da-da. Future researchers replicated the same finding, e.g. P. Chen et al. And these are two different Chens. One is R. Chen, one's P. Chen. That's the only time you ever give initials in an in-text citation. And if there's the same last name and same first initial or same initials, which I have had happen once in my career, then you don't try to distinguish. You don't actually list someone's first name in the in-text citation. You just cite them the standard way. You only need the initials if the initials are different. Okay. Let's talk about quotation. Quotations reproduce material word for word. Paraphrasing restates ideas in your own words. Generally, you should paraphrase. That should be the default. But I understand that occasionally something is worded so well you can't improve upon it, or you can't find a way to restate in your own words that doesn't sound like a whole lot like the original. In that case, you may quote, but quotations should not be excessive in a paper. People want to read your writing. They don't want to read your ability to string together a bunch of quotations. Whenever you quote or paraphrase the works of others, you need to cite so that you can avoid plagiarism. It's also possible to self-plagiarize. See sections 8.2 and 8.3 of the manual. The APA manual defers to instructors. My rule is that you cannot use material from another class in my classes unless you get permission from both instructors. So assume that you can use knowledge and things you've learned and things you've read for other classes, but you cannot use the words word for word. You need to paraphrase again and adapt it for my class. Like I said, whenever possible, paraphrase. The paraphrase, though, should be an accurate representation of what the original text means. And do credit authors when you paraphrase, because you're using their ideas, you're describing their work, and they need to be credited for that. It's not required to provide a page number or a paragraph, but it helps readers. It's nice. I do it if I'm citing a really long work, like a book. Oh, here's a 300-page book. I don't want you to have to search that for the one idea I'm paraphrasing, so it's on page 112. You know, I do that, and that's nice. People like it when you do that. If you have a long paraphrase that's several sentences, you don't have to repeat the citation after every sentence. Instead, you should include it at least once. Usually at the end of the block that you're paraphrasing, although not required. If you're doing a narrative citation, you might mention it at the beginning. And then we just assume that any words you're using are from the same source, unless you start talking about a different source or you cite other works in the meantime. So if you talk about one article, cite another, then when you resume talking about the first article, you need to recite it. And that way we know here's the material from each article. And you see an example here. Dotson, 2018, experimentally manipulated. Dotson then provided participants. You don't need the date again when you're still talking about Dotson. These findings and others show that now you're citing other stuff. And if you go back talking about Dotson, you should cite the year again. There's an example, and you can look at similar examples in the APA manual. And here's another example of, here's the author. You're not mentioning the year again when you talk about them, but then if you put their material back in a parenthetical citation, you need to mention the year again. And if you started talking about Kohler again, you would need to put the year again in the next paragraph. Direct quotations need the exact either page number that the quotation's found on. If there aren't any page numbers, for example, it's a website or it's a short work that doesn't have numbered pages, then you should be numbering the paragraphs. You abbreviate page as P if the quote is on multiple pages, like it starts on one page and spills onto the next one. You do PP. For paragraph, you abbreviate that as PARA. Paragraphs is PARAS. And notice each of those has a period afterwards. If the quote goes from one page to another without interruption or the material you're talking about, you use a dash. But if you're using discontinuous pages, you separate those as a comma. So this example, these page numbers are everything from 39 through 47, but we're not talking about pages 48 or 49. We are talking about page 50. Okay. If you're citing a audio-visual work like a audio recording or a YouTube video, instead of page numbers or paragraphs, you use timestamps so that people can find this material easier. For a quotation less than 40 words, you just quote those in text. You use double quote marks around all of the words you're reusing. And you always include the full citation, whether it's a parenthetical or narrative citation, in the same sentence as the quotation. So if you're going to quote, you have to have the author's surnames, you have to have the year, and you have to have the page number, or if it's not a page number size, a paragraph number, within the same sentence. So put that citation in before the closing period somewhere. If there's a period or a comma that's part of the material, you put that inside the quotation marks unless it's a closing period. And you can see examples on the next slide. Okay. So an example here, you have because high performance, da-da-da-da-da. Notice the sentence is ending. This is the end of the sentence. Close your quotation marks, put your citation in, period. Notice the citation is first author, et al. In this case, comma, 2018, comma, P period, space, the page number, close parentheses, and then end your sentence. Down here, the report concluded by asking the question, and then notice the question mark is inside the parentheses, but there's a period over here. That's because this period is ending this sentence that the example begins with, but the question mark, but this original sentence is not a question, so the question mark goes inside the citation. And notice group name, comma, year, comma, paragraph abbreviation, P-A-R-A, period, space, 4. You always have a space after either the page or period abbreviation and the actual number. One thing that's different that I want you to notice in the first example is that we don't include an ellipsis anymore in APA style, the ... to show that we're omitting the beginning or an end of a sentence. We don't do that unless the original source has an ellipsis at the beginning or the end. You do include a ... if you're omitting something in the middle of your quote, but we don't need to show over here with the ... that we're starting mid-sentence of this quote. And so that's something that's new with APA 7th edition that you need to be aware of. Okay. Here's what a narrative citation looks like. Quartz and Suarez. There's the date. Consider each participant, and then we have the quote. And then there's a space here, and then you have your citation. We don't need the author's surnames and the date because they're already here in the narrative. So as long as you mention each piece, then you don't have to put them in the same parentheses. Or you can say, here's your quote, here's the author, and then date and, in this case, paragraph number. So you can put paragraph number and page number together in the same set of parentheses. That's okay, or you can separate them into two different ones, whichever makes the most sense. Now that was for short quotations. If we have a long quotation then that's 40 words or more, we call this a block quotation. You should start a block quotation as a new paragraph. And you set this aside and show that it is a quotation, not only with the new paragraph, but also by indenting all lines, an entire half-inch on the left. If you're quoting more than one paragraph within your quotation, then that new paragraph is indented an extra half-inch compared to all of the lines in the quotation line, in the block quotation. With your block quotes, your long 40 words or more block quotes, you should always include the full citation and the page number, or if it needs a paragraph number or a timestamp. Do not double space the block quotation, and you don't add an extra space before or after. It should be single spaced. And do not put quotation marks around the block quotation. The fact that it is single spaced, it has an extra indentation on the left, tells us that this is a quote. And you don't put the final citation inside the period here. So here's an example. Researchers have studied how people talk to themselves, and then this big chunk is a long quote. We know it's a quote because the entire quote is half an inch indented compared to the other text. And then notice here we end the sentence and then we put the citation. So when you have a block quotation, do not put your citation inside the quote mark, inside the sentence. But beyond that, the citation format's the same. You also have the option of doing a narrative citation for a block quotation. In that case, you mention the author and the year, if you want to, beforehand, and then you start your block quotation, and then period to end it, and then you put the location, the pages or the paragraph or the timestamp afterwards. Notice that because this quotation starts on one page and ends on another, we have PP period space, and then 173 to 174. You also have the option of putting this year down here and just put a comma between it. That's okay. And you have a couple of examples. And if you want to learn more about APA style, you can follow APA style on social media. It actually gives you a lot of great hints and tips. I strongly recommend it. But now you've learned everything about in-text citations. I expect all of your in-text citations and all of your papers to be correct. There's no excuse. And so I wish you the best of luck with your papers.